Hi guys, it's Mr. Gonzalez again, here with Lesson 4, the grand staff and ledger lines, also known as the middle notes. The main objective of today's lesson is to be able to identify the components of a grand staff and being able to identify the ledger line notes between the grand staff. Let's get going. When the bass and treble staves are connected by a brace and a line, they combine to form the grand staff. Here you can see our brace, and here you can see our line. It's important to note that whenever you have a line, it goes through both the treble clef and the bass clef staves. Here we also see all of the line and space notes for the bass clef, as well as all the line and space notes for the treble clef. Ledger lines are short lines which are added to extend the range of the staff when notes are too low or too high to be written on the staff. The notes in the middle range of the grand staff are B, C, and D. They can be written on ledger lines in both the bass and treble clef staves. Here we can see the ledger lines of the bass clef. Our first note B does not need a ledger line. It sits on top of the fifth line of the bass clef. Our C needs a line that goes through it, and then our D sits on top of the line. So we can consider this a space note, a line note, and a second space note. In the treble clef, however, we see that D hangs below the first line, C, like the bass clef, has a line through it, and B now sits below the ledger line. So we have one space note, one line note, and another space note. These notes are written differently, but sound the same. We can see that B, C, and D come right next to each other on the piano. When we're looking at D, we're looking at this note, no matter which clef we are looking at. When we are looking at C, no matter which clef, this is the sound it makes. Same with B. Even though it looks different, they still make the same sound. Let's take a look at some exercises. For our first exercise, we are going to write the letter names of the notes from the treble staff. Let's go. For our first note in the treble staff, we see it sits right below the first line, but it does not sit on or have a ledger line go through it. This is D. Next, we have a note on the third line. We can use our line sentence of every good boy. This is B. Here we see a note that sits below the treble clef staff and below the first ledger line. This is another B. Here we have a note on the second space, so we can use our word face to help us out. We have F, A, C, and E. This is an A. Here we have a note on the fourth space. Again, we can use face. So we have F, A, C, and E. For our next note, we have a note that's below the treble clef staff, but it has a line through it. So since it's on the first ledger line, this is a C. Here we have a note on the second line. We can use our sentence, every good. This is a G. Then lastly, like our first one we saw earlier, we have a note that sits below the treble clef, but also does not have a ledger line attached to it. This is D. For our second exercise, we are going to write the letter names of the notes for the bass staff. Let's go. Our first note is a note above the bass staff with a line through it. We know that this is C. Next, we see a note on the third line of the bass staff, so we can use the sentence, good, boys, do, fine, always. This is a D. Next, we see a note sitting right on top of the fifth line of the staff. Since it does not have a line through it, and it is not sitting above a ledger line, we know that this is B. Next, we see a note on the fourth line of the staff. Again, we can use our sentence, good, boys, do, fine, always. This is an F. Here's something new. We see a note on the second space. Since the space note, we can use the sentence, all cows eat grass. So we have all cows. This is a C. Here we see a note above the bass staff and above the first ledger line. This is a D. Next, we see a note on the fourth space. We can use our sentence, all cows eat grass. This is a G. Then last, we see a note that is above the bass staff and has a ledger line through it. This is a C. For our last exercise, we are going to write the notes indicated by the clefs and letter names in two places on the grand staff. Add ledger lines where necessary. I have placed our notes on the clef we will be using. So if it's up here, we will use the treble clef. If it's down here, we will use the bass clef. Let's go. So we need a B in the treble clef in two spots. We know that the area right below the very first ledger line is a B, and we also know that if we use the sentence every good boy, we have another B on the third line. Here we have a B for the bass clef. Let's look. We have good boys, so we have a B here. And then we know if we have a note that sits right above the bass clef staff, we have a second B. Now we need D for the treble clef. We just learned that if we have a note that sits right below the first line of the treble staff, we have D. And from previous lessons, we know that we have a D on the fourth line because every good boy does. Again, we have a B for the treble clef. So we have the space right underneath the first ledger line and the third space. Here we have a C for the bass clef. Let's look. We can use our sentence, all cows eat grass, to help us out with the note on the staff. So we have a C here. And we know that if there is a line through a note above the bass clef, we have a C. In the treble clef, we're looking for C again. So we know if it's below the treble clef staff and it has a line through it, we have C. Then we also can use face to get us our second C. So we have F, A, and C. Lastly, we're looking for a D in the bass clef. We can use our sentence, good boys do, and we have a D here. And lastly, if it sits above the first ledger line, like so, we have another D. And that's it for today's lesson, guys. I hope you feel more confident in your ability to identify the grand staff and the ledger lines between the grand staff. In our next lesson, we will be taking a deeper look at ledger lines.